Particular greeting that I have to do a mea culpa on that I did not acknowledge earlier on tonight is our great friend, the High Commissioner of Australia, Natasha Smith. Natasha, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being in Australia. We love Australia for so many reasons. It's a pleasure to have you here. I am so very delighted now to introduce our panel. This conversation will be spectacular, in large part, not just because of the quality of our panelists, but because of the person who's moderating it. Mercedes Stephenson, as many of you will know, is an important journalist who has covered foreign affairs and defense issues for decades now. She has a capacity to create some of the most thoughtful and compelling conversations, posing insightful questions to a myriad of participants. We have such a large number of robust personalities on our panel today. I know she'll carry it on expertly. And I have the added pleasure to tell you, I've known her since we were teenagers in Calgary, so it's with a great deal of pride I'd like to welcome Mercedes Stephenson to the podium, the stage. Along with her, we're going to be reconvening David Mulroney and General Spalding. Would you please also come find your places on the stage here? And we've also been able to welcome two spectacular other panelists. The first is Hideshi Tokuchi, Senior Fellow at Japan's National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, and the former Vice Minister of Defense. Hideshi, welcome. Thank you for being here, sir. And Dhruva Jaishankar, who heads the new U.S. initiative of the Observer Research Foundation, India's largest non-governmental think tank. He previously worked at Brookings India, the German Marshall Fund, the Brookings Institution, and contributes regularly to the Indian and international media on international affairs and security. He has a new book coming out fairly soon, within months, years? Soon. We cajole him because we can't wait to see it. So without any further ado, Mercedes, over to you.
Thank you, Shu. Well, thank you for not telling embarrassing stories about high school speech and debate, which is how we know each other, but clearly it pays off. I am so thrilled to be here tonight to get to talk to such an incredible panel about very important issues that are both global, but for Canada, very much front of mind right now in terms of especially China, information operations, and the Indo-Pacific. But before I get started, I want to recognize somebody who has done this job before, who is in the audience, because he has led Canadian reporting on China, and that is Robert Fife, my former boss. I'm not sucking up. He's now the bureau chief of the Globe and Mail, but he is really the person who's put so much of this China reporting and questions about things like Huawei on the agenda and pushed that with Parliament and with our democratic institutions. So with that, let's dive into a bit of an opener, a little bit of getting our appetite wet here, as we already have with the Indo-Pacific, with the phenomenal speeches we heard. But I'm going to start with the most open-ended question before we start to narrow in a little bit. And I'm going to start with you, Dhruva. Can you tell us, why is it that a free and open Indo-Pacific is so important? What's really at stake here?
So thanks for having me. Good evening to all of you. Bonsoir. Konbanwa. Welcome. I hope you've all enjoyed yourself as much as I have. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I like to break down what we mean when we talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, particularly for lay audiences. A few years ago, this was a phrase that was used by some of us security wonks when I'd go to Australia or Tokyo or Taiwan, or this was a kind of a wonky phrase that was in circulation, and a lot of time was spent in these Talmudic discussions about what do we actually mean by a free and open Indo-Pacific, I think the first point to make is that different countries have, over time, come up with their own Indo-Pacific policies. Australia was amongst the first, actually, and it was included, the phrase Indo-Pacific was featured very prominently in their foreign policy and the defense policy white papers around 2013 or thereabouts. Japan was very early, and actually Prime Minister Abe, I think, was really critical in pushing for the notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific and using that phraseology. In India, where I'm from, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the previous Prime Minister, actually used this in a speech in 2013 that he gave in Tokyo. But the current government of Prime Minister Modi actually took this forward, and a couple of years ago at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Prime Minister Modi kind of fleshed out what he thought a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, which was to use his phraseology, meant. And then, of course, the U.S. government came around to this view. The national security strategy that General referred to earlier actually highlighted the Indo-Pacific as key. So while all of these countries have slightly different perspectives as to what it means based on geography, based on their own values, their own priorities, I think a few things stand out in terms of commonalities. One, I think it's quite clear that the Indian and Pacific Oceans today constitute a single strategic space. And I think this is the most important takeaway from this. Today, China is active, and it has a military base in Djibouti. Japan is active in Djibouti. You have the Belt and Road Initiative playing changing economies in Africa, in East Africa, and South Africa. So suddenly this wider region has become more intertwined. The second, I think, takeaway is that the maritime domain matters more than it has in recent years. And by defining this broad region by the oceans rather than by the land masses, it's shifting our thinking about the importance of the maritime domain, both for security and for commerce. A third thing, I think, elevating the importance of the Indian Ocean in popular consciousness. This is a region that is a major conduit for world energy trade, for trade as a whole. It's an increasing zone of security competition. It's also, home to 2 billion people in some of the fastest growing regions in the world. And so the Indian Ocean Basin, including that in this construct is important. And finally, I think the free and open part is important, which is the implication being that this is a zone that is contested, but must be governed by a set of mutually agreed norms and values. And this is, I think, where different countries are coming from when they try and advance a free and open Indo-Pacific policy.
Hideshi, Japan is in such a unique situation. You are a regional and global leader, an island. You have to worry about China. You have to worry about North Korea. You have to worry about so many different angles and this interesting position you're in between the Western Alliance and Asia. Why do you think maintaining that free and open relationship is critical for societies around the Indo-Pacific region?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me thank the MLI for inviting me to this great event. And let me congratulate the 10th anniversary of MLI. Actually, I'm a little bit nervous because we are, surrounded by tanks and guns, and even a military plane is flying over us. But, I feel very much relieved because this situation is much different from the Tiananmen Square in June 1989. So I'm very much relieved to be here. And anyway, thank you very much for having me in this great event. Well, the notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific is very much interesting to all of us. And actually, all the maritime space is connected. So therefore, the sea is one. So the concept of the Indo-Pacific is very natural to us in a sense because that notion hyphenates the two great oceans, the world's largest ocean and the third largest ocean. But as the sea is one, the rule governing the oneness of the sea must be one. However, China is violating the important rule of law in East Asia. So that's a very much concern for all of us. And actually today, there are so many things we have to think about because the new term, originally we were accustomed to using the word Asia-Pacific. And Asia-Pacific, actually the word Asia-Pacific connects large landmass and the ocean. Of course, the Asia-Pacific or Asia, or that region is a combination of large landmass and a huge sea space. So it is still the Asia-Pacific. However, why did we use the word Asia-Pacific? There are two reasons. The US and Australia. Because the US is a Pacific nation, geographically and politically and historically and economically. But the US is not an Asian power. But the US will have to continue to be a stakeholder in that region. Therefore, the US shouldn't be regarded as an outsider. That's why the notion of the Asia-Pacific is very, very important. And secondly, Australia. Because of the UK's integration in the European community in the 1980s and 90s, the Australians became more cooperative to the Asians. So in that aspect as well, the new notion of the Asia-Pacific was very much important. And already the US is conscious that it is an Asia-Pacific nation, and Australia is fully integrated into Asia. Therefore, in that sense, the fundamental role, the basic role of the notion, the Asia-Pacific, is, well, I think I can say it's over. However, there are new challenges. First is, of course, China's maritime advancement. China's activities in the South China Sea is against the rules of common rules of international law. And when China became more assertive in the South China Sea, many people said that the final objective of China is not in the South China Sea, but in the Indian Ocean and the Middle East and far beyond. And today, China's PLA Navy is operating in the Indian Ocean for the purpose of, in their term, open sea protection. And it has had China's first ever overseas station in Djibouti since 2017, and China funded the development of seaport facilities around the Indian Ocean. And experts point out the possibility that China will use those port facilities as its naval bases, and even Chinese submarines will open in the Indo-Pacific region more frequently. But that's a challenge. But there is one more point to mention. It's rise of India. India gives us a large opportunity. India's population is more than 1 billion right now, and it will continue to grow probably in the next 50 years or so. And India's economy is also growing, and it is India's GDP is now 6th in the world, almost exceeding that of the UK, and the population bonus will continue to work until 2040 or so. So there is a big chance in India. So that's another thing. And one more, if I may say one more thing, it's a change of Africa. Still, poverty is over there, and diseases are over there, and the natural resource boom is over. But the population is growing, and Africa will be the next center of growth in the world. So the investors' capabilities are growing, and not only China, but also India and Turkey and Korea and many other countries are increasing their trade investment in Africa. Therefore, in that region, there are so many challenges, of course, including North Korea. Actually, we shouldn't forget North Korea. We often tend to focus on South China Sea or Indian Ocean or Chinese Navy, but we shouldn't forget North Korea threat as well. But anyway, there are so many challenges and opportunities in that region.
And Hideshi, when you brought up there the influence of China, clearly really the primary concern, whether it is in the ocean, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in all these other places where China is expanding its influence. And David, of course, you were Canada's ambassador to China, and it's something you've been talking about a tremendous amount in the media, in public, as Canada.
I prefer that to incessantly. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I would never say that because I might need you to clip. But you really informed a lot of the dialogues. I want to flip the question a little bit with you and not ask why does it matter, because we've heard from two people whose countries are directly affected by this, but is it even still free and open? Is that an accurate way to describe the Indo-Pacific at this point, or has China already expanded its influence to the point where that's no longer the case?
So I think it's less free and open than it was in very real terms with the steady expansion of Chinese island building in Southeast Asia, for example, with China's growing influence through Belt and Road, which is very real and consequential. We're paying for the fact that we're paying for 2 decades and more of inattention to this. But again, I don't think it's too late. The other thing is, people have pointed out that Indo-Pacific means something a little bit different depending on what capital you're in. And it should mean something a little different for Canada too. I think it means a chance for us for a reset on an Asia-Pacific policy that we've been talking about through my whole career and beyond, that we never have managed to get right, in part because it has been so heavily focused on China. So there's a chance to rebalance and look first at India, where we have deep roots and old friendships, but we've really lost a lot of the credibility that we had in the through those years in which we primarily lectured India on strategic issues and on issues arising from its relationship with Pakistan. So it's a chance to get that right. But the piece of the puzzle that's important for Canada is Indo-Pacific still includes China. And I think some people would like to say the relationship isn't working for us. Maybe we can just go somewhere else. We can't. We still have to work out, and that's the really hard part, how do we continue to engage China? Let's look at what's happening right now. Coronavirus. I had in the embassy an officer from the Public Health Agency of Canada whose job post-SARS was to monitor and to look at these things. What happens in China reverberates all over the world and in Canada. We can't take our eyes off it, but we need to design a very different way of engaging it. Final thing I'd say is Canada has a role in Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific security that is important and I think of relevance to the United States. What's been encouraging to see is the increasing activity by the Australians, by the French, by the Royal Navy and others in a region that they had, for the French and the British, hadn't been as active in for some time. They've been sailing in those contested waters. I think there's a role for Canada too, and the Canadian Navy has been stepping up to that. And the important point here is to say, this is not a Sino-American rivalry for hegemony. This is an expression of concern by states like the United States, but also like Canada, like France, like the UK, like Australia and New Zealand, who care about the rule of law and who care about global governance. So our participation in this gets noticed in China, not because we're an overwhelming power, but because China begins to count heads when it faces opposition. And when there are enough people in the room who are in opposition, it begins to think of things in a different way. It's convenient to portray this as a Sino-American, battle for hegemony, but it should be portrayed as much more than that, and Canada can help.
I want to come back to what you said in just a minute about India and about the Canadian Navy, but Robert, many Canadians are watching very closely what's happening in the United States when it comes to China policy. Obviously, the way that Donald Trump has addressed that has been quite unique. It's been the carrot and the stick. And you now have this initial trade deal signed, which is not finished, but it's an initial step. And he's been directly challenging and yet also praising China at times. How does that play into the long-term strategy? And you're a military guy, so you have a strategic mind, but you also understand geopolitics. With trying to ensure encouraging China does the kinds of things people want in the Indo-Pacific, is it effective at the end of the day?
Well, we have to recognize that China, and it's led by a regime led by a few folks, and that's a Chinese Communist Party that has its own interests and really pursues those interests irregardless of what we would like them to be. And I think that's the big change in what's been happening in Washington, D.C., is beginning to realize what kind of regime they have, what kind of interests they seek to achieve, and balancing that with the interests of both the United States and our allies and partners going forward. You know, I talked about this idea of the Atlantic Charter that really talked about the world that we wanted to build after World War II. And we saw that being eroded by the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, not over its own citizens, or just over its own citizens, but over the globe. And I think there's essentially three pieces to this puzzle, and one is protecting our societies from the influence of totalitarianism and authoritarianism in a globalized and internet-connected world. This is where the trade war comes into play. This is where CFIUS reform comes into play. This is where things like Enforcing Foreign Corrupt Practices Act comes into play, really enforcing the rule of law on Chinese entities and individuals that seek to be part of the global architecture, protect, rebuild. And that's really where I'm hopeful that in the next administration, whoever's elected in 2020, we begin to reinvest in our communities, in our societies, in our democracies. We have in the United States essentially offloaded most of our productive capacity since China entered the WTO. We've failed to invest in our own infrastructure. We've failed to invest in our own manufacturing base, in our own STEM education, in our own science and technology, really in a way that we did during the Cold War. So we need to rebuild democratic societies. So this goes not just for the United States. All of these things, whether it's on the protect or the rebuild side, our communities have to invest. And so rather than sending capital to China, which is what we've been doing collectively, both from the financial industry and the corporate sector, we need to invest in democracies. And then the last piece, and this is really where we talked about and we started with in the national security strategy, principles, values. How do we inspire faith and really embracing the democratic model? Because essentially what's happened here is that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to use our technology, our talent, our innovation and capital, repackaged in Chinese Communist Party ideology and re-exported to the world to create this perception amongst emerging market economies that totalitarianism or authoritarian capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, is a better model for their people than democracy and free trade. And it's not because democracy and free trade doesn't work. It's because we've kind of taken our eye off the ball and allowed it to, essentially this idea of open markets leading to wealth and wealth leading to democracy, and that openness would allow us to spread democracy. That worked for a time, but essentially authoritarians figured it out, and they began to use openness as a means for reversing that dynamic, so that rather than spreading democracy into the world, that authoritarianism used the tools of economics, finance, trade, and information to begin to export their principles into the. And so it's really about economies coming together, and that's what our strategy is about. It's about embracing democratic principles, free trade, rule of law, and self-determination, and refocusing those collectively as a group of democracies to inspire other nations that this is a better model.
Dhruva, does there have to be a consequence if that doesn't work? Because you're trying to inspire other nations. India is a regional leader. If just trying to make the argument, and God forbid as a journalist who lives by words, that argument is not convincing, does there have to be something harder, whether it's economic or military, to assert that kind of protection and to assert India's own sovereignty, but also to find allies in the region that way?
So, I think just to echo what some of the statements that have been made so far, I think some of the critics of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, both in China and sometimes in other countries as well, have raised this as a containment strategy against China. And I think that's a real straw man argument. It's using the vocabulary and the concepts of the Cold War that are really not very applicable today. What I think the issue is, and I think this is where a lot of countries are speaking, if not with one voice, at least in a similar, are pushing in a similar direction, is really similar concerns about the manner of China's rise and its behavior. And it really, I think, is essentially four things. One, that China is a rising global power that is not transparent about the way it makes decisions. This is very fundamentally different from the notion of the United States as a global superpower. It's not as if the US made decisions that everybody agreed with. I think a lot of you will remember the Iraq War and then certainly many other things that have taken place. But the fact is the US has an open system of governance, and we know, who has made those decisions. They're accountable to somebody. In China, this is fundamentally not true in a single-party state. The second, I think, element to this is unfair economic practices. And this includes espionage, this includes mercantilist economic policies, this includes a number of things, again, that we're all aware of today, which means that effectively China is not offering the same level playing field. And in some ways, I think the pushback we've seen from the Trump administration and from many others is really about trying to recalibrate that relationship. So far, not entirely with success, but I think making an effort in that direction. A third element is about territorial revisionism. And you see this in the South China Sea, you see this in the East China Sea with the Senkaku-Diaoyu dispute with Japan. You see this in the Himalayas where India and China had a standoff in 2017, as well as one in 2013, 2014, and with Bhutan as well. And so, again, you have seen attempts, often using nominally civilian tools, whether it's maritime militia or other means, to try and change the facts on the ground. And finally, I think there is a certain disrespect for international norms, at least international norms that have been widely accepted when it comes to internet governance, when it comes to sustainable infrastructure financing, and a number of other areas as well, where I think that, you have seen a sort of normative erosion taking place. So, I think the pushback we have seen from China, whether in different ways and at different levels, whether it's from India, whether it's from Japan, whether it's from the United States and others, has been some element of these combinations. And it's not to say that China does not deserve a place as part of the global community. I think everyone agrees. Everyone partners with China. It's its largest trade partner. It has pulled millions of people out of poverty. But I do think laying out this rationale is helpful in trying to change Chinese behavior. And I think it does involve a sense of carrots and sticks. So India, for example, has boycotted the Belt and Road Initiative and has set out a set of normative reasons for why it has chosen to do so. Not every country has agreed. Japan, for example, has opted to cooperate in certain ways with BRI projects. But I do think that there is a sort of a broad push in the same direction that we're seeing.
David, I'd have a two-point sort of question for you. First of all, just to respond to what we've heard on China, particularly, and I think of this because we're all sitting here enjoying a lovely dinner while there are two Canadian citizens in jail who Canadian government sources have described as political hostages. They've been in jail for over a year now. We have no indication that they will be released anytime soon. Strategically, when you're dealing with China, it's never all good or all bad. It's a complicated country. It's a complicated place. It can do a lot of good. But which way do you see the country overall under its current administration going in terms of a force for good or a force for bad? And I'd follow that up by saying, why is it you think we don't have a closer relationship with India?
So I think I began to see a change in China at the start of my time as ambassador, 2009. And up until that point, you had the success of the Beijing Olympics. There was still the euphoria of China's economic performance. There was still a generally positive sense, and still this lingering sense that somehow China, as it got richer and more people became prosperous, it would become more like us. Then, as the economic crisis deepened, in 2009 in particular, China began to read its own headlines and believe its own headlines, and that's always dangerous, because the headlines were China can do no wrong, China is infallible, look at these airports, look at these expressways, look at the miracle that is the eastern seaboard of China. And you had Canadians would flood into my office saying, oh, I've seen the future and it's China, and why can't our system work this way? And I think the Chinese made the mistake of believing that. And you could see an increasing sense of even arrogance in the way they dealt with lesser states. When I first served in China and got to know Chinese officials back in the 80s, one of the things that impressed me was they weren't zero-sum. And in an argument or in a disagreement, even if they won, they'd leave you with something. You'd go away with something. And they took pains to relate to and try to stay friendly with even small states. That was over by 2009. And one interesting thing, from the perspective, I'm a Catholic, and I had read Pope Benedict's 2008 letter to the Catholics of China and to the people of China, which was a really interesting effort to get through the patriotic church and the underground church and to bring things together, and really an offer of reconciliation that should have been taken up. And it was taken up for a few months, but the Chinese response immediately was to crack down. So I felt that in my own life, I could sort of see this response from China happening. Then, of course, we have the Xi Jinping era. And Xi Jinping is a totally different person than Hu Jintao, his predecessor. He's someone whose father was purged. He himself was sent to the countryside. So you'd say, why in the world would he be such an ardent party person? The reality is he thinks it's safer inside the tent than outside the tent. And he has pushed relentlessly for a hardening of lines in all kinds of areas. So China has become in no way a force for good. It's been a force for of great concern in its region. It's been a destabilizing force. It's been a force that has been interfering and reaching into other societies. My heart goes out to the families of those two detained Canadians. Let's not forget, this is not the first time. When Canada picked up an aerospace technician named Su Bin, and he was sent to the United States and subsequently convicted of espionage, they picked up a couple who ran a coffee shop on the border with North Korea. They were a Christian couple who, you can imagine this place would be where visitors gather and talk about all kinds of things. They were seen as vulnerable because the Chinese could say, oh, they were up by North Korea. And they were separated, they were imprisoned. The husband was in prison for more than a year. And so this is something that China has adopted, and they're using it because it works. So I'm very concerned about the way forward with China. I'm very concerned about how we manage this, and I'm concerned about the safety of Canadians in China.
Hideshi, obviously you have a very geographically close relationship, and I've had the previous Japanese ambassador on the show who's now moved on to another post. When I talked to him, he talked about Japanese business people who had been jailed in China, and they were in for several years, and he said, you better get ready for a long time because China doesn't release people quickly or easily. Some people are watching what's happening with coronavirus, and they're suggesting that it could be an opening, it could be a softening for China, it could be a chance to connect. Do you believe that, or do you believe that this is a blip on the map? China's going to cooperate internationally right now and then pull back from that and close once again?
Well, there are a number of challenges, traditional challenges and non-traditional challenges in the world, and even in Northeast Asia as well. And talking about the viruses and non-traditional security, viruses do not recognize any national borders. And they don't care about national borders or man-made borders. So we need to cooperate with China, but it has a limitation. For example, let's think about Taiwan. Taiwan is a very close friend of Japan's and a close friend of Canada's. And Taiwan is located just in the middle of the first island chain. And also it is located between the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And Taiwan is a thriving democracy experiencing a number of change of governments after elections. but Taiwan is excluded from World Health Organization. And a number of countries, including Japan and the United States, is trying hard to have Taiwan in that framework. But China is quite adamant. So those kind of possibilities about non-traditional security will continue to have a limit in cooperation with China. Today, China is challenging the rules-based liberal international order under the banner of what they say, a community with shared interest for mankind. But we don't know what it means. And at the same time, actually, different from a little bit different from your direct question, but the notion of the liberal international order is a Western idea, and actually lots of states welcome such model of capitalism and governance, and grateful for the benefits which the liberal international order generates, but not all the people in this world. And brutal authoritarianism, digital authoritarianism, represented by China, is thriving, and China is exporting its digital authoritarianism to developing countries, and we know that. So therefore, we need to, our side need to stick together, even in this, globalized world, I think.
Robert, let's, since we're surrounded by tanks and fighter jet and all kinds of military equipment, not quite the B-2, but when you look at the region, what are the security threats that you think present the greatest concern, and what is the best way to mitigate them? And I'm not just thinking about states here, because so far we've been talking about states, China. The reality is, in the Indo-Pacific, there are some very dangerous and serious players, whether it's organized crime or terrorism, that are at play.
Well, so, I think we've proven that, collectively we can deal with a lot of those things. I think the challenge of the Indo-Pacific is far different than Europe or the Middle East. And quite frankly, we've designed militaries for Europe and the Middle East, and those don't travel well to the Indo-Pacific. And the challenge is the great distances of water. And so one of the key things that the Trump administration did was to pull out of the INF Treaty. And the purpose of pulling out of the INF Treaty was not because the Russians were cheating. The purpose of it was to design a deterrence mechanism in the region. The two things that really need to be focused on within the Indo-Pacific region when it comes to these things is about deterrence and about preventing coercion. And for 20 years, we've been focused on fighting in the Middle East. And at the same time, the Chinese have been building this military that, quite frankly, far outpaces in terms of mass what we can generate in the region. And that is creating an environment that allows for intimidation and coercion, and creates a potential for conflict by allowing this provocative weakness, certainly within the first island chain, and because of the ranges of those weapons, out to the second island chain. So, and the challenge really, because we built militaries for the Middle East and Europe, that for every dollar of offense that the Chinese uses to push American and other forces out of the region, we have to spend $30 to project power into the region. That is not a balance that we can actually win. And we knew this during the Cold War, particularly in the Fulda Gap, when the Soviets were spending 40% of GDP and really amassing power in the European theater. And so we focused on deterrence, and we focused on building our economies and our societies and our science and technological prowess. And so I think going forward, we need to figure out how we're going to structure militaries for the Indo-Pacific that actually take advantage of some of the same technologies and capabilities that the Chinese have deployed in a way that provides deterrence in the region in a cost-effective manner that can actually allow us to invest in our own economies and societies, and also that allows the region to knit together this ability to prevent the coercion that's currently occurring, particularly within the South China Sea, out in the Indian Ocean, and in the East China Sea. So it's about deterrence, it's about preventing coercion, and quite frankly, we've gotten out of that business for far too long.
Does that mean, Robert, that some countries like Canada have abdicated their responsibility? And I think of this because our Navy is under tremendous pressure right now. It's very small. We have other ships that are coming, but the dates have been sliding. There's been tremendous challenges, difficulties with even being able to resupply our own ships. Has that largely left the Americans a bit on their own in terms of defending what to this point has largely been naval deterrence if you get outside of the nuclear realm?
Well, we have to think about how do we deliver combat power into the region in a way that's cost effective using the resources that we have. So, I mean, one of the things that was talked about here is about energy security. So right now, most of the refining capacity that's in the Pacific is actually, quite frankly, contracted by the Chinese. And so how do you supply your military if you're going to project power in the region? So Canada can play a big role in that. And so thinking about not just how we take the resources that we currently have to efficiently provide combat power in the region, but how do we think differently about those resources that we project in the region? Because quite frankly, the way that the Chinese have employed long or intermediate range conventional ballistic and cruise missiles has negated the way we've designed militaries, which are really built around, 3 major logistics hubs in the region, major air bases in the region, and carrier battle groups, all of which are vulnerable to those weapons. So we have to think differently about how we project power in the region, and we have to do it in conjunction with our allies and partners. Again, it's about growing our economies and our societies, but there is a military piece to this, but it has to be deployed in a way that deters conflict and prevents coercion, but doesn't bankrupt our societies to do it.
Dhruva, India has a massive army, and it's something a lot of people here don't think about, but it's very professional, it's very large, it's very powerful. How does India handle the security threats, not only externally in the region, but internally as well?
So, India faces both internal and external, quite severe sometimes internal and external security challenges from terrorism, cyber threats, now a lot of non-traditional security challenges. It also has 2 neighbors, Pakistan and China, with which it has large territorial disputes. With China, it's over area roughly the size of the U.S. state of Montana, home to 2 million people that is disputed between India and China. So it's not a minor territorial dispute. While India does have a big army, I think the general thinking in India today is that's turning out to be a bit of a liability. Today, India spends more on pensions for its military than it does on new military equipment, which it badly needs. In fact, it has, looking around here, it has sometimes tanks that are not too different from some of these World War II vintage tanks. So while the need of the hour is sort of a real modernization effort, the Indian defense budget is really hamstrung by what is a very large military. There's also an imbalance between the army. The army has traditionally been the largest service at the expense of the Air Force and especially the Navy. And I think one of the big changes we've seen just in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years or so, has been a real change in the Indian Navy's posture. So today, starting in late 2017, the Indian Navy actually changed its operational deployment pattern and now patrols year-round, 24/7, 7 zones in the Indian Ocean, from the Straits of Malacca to the Gulf of Aden. This is a major change. It now has arrangements with several countries, the United States, France. It's negotiating one with Japan right now for acquisition and cross-servicing for basically logistics, mutual logistics support agreements. It's increased communication, so India and the United States now have secure communications on their platforms. So this has really allowed the Indian Navy to extend its reach into parts of the Pacific as well. Again, a major change. However, it still remains quite, it's very similar to the challenges that Canada and others face, which is it really is short on vessels, both its submarine fleet and its surface fleet. And so I expect actually even in the next couple of weeks we may see some announcements on some defense purchases by the Indian Navy. So it is a major issue. So while attempts are being made to remedy this imbalance, I worry it's not fast enough.
Hideshi, I want to ask you about a country that we've only touched in passing, and that's North Korea, because it was very, literally dominating the headlines when Donald Trump had that historic meeting with Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un made a lot of promises about denuclearization, and when he doesn't get what he wants, Japan is his #1 target for intimidation. Can you give us a sense of what's going on with North Korea right now, and how is Japan able to try to defend itself against that threat, and whether or not it's growing?
Well, thank you very much for that very important question. But before that, I would like to add one comment to what General Spalding said about security cooperation and military engagement in that region, particularly to Southeast Asia. Of course, we know that every country has, limitation in military assets. But the security cooperation and military engagement is not only about operations. One of the problems of that region, particularly the South China Sea region, is the lack of balance of power. And China has been exploiting the power vacuum for many, many years. So in the short run, we have to fill the vacuum by enhancing our presence, joint presence and unilateral presence in concert. But in the long run, we need to help those developing countries, particularly around the South China Sea, establish their own security and safety capability, maritime security capabilities. So we can cooperate with them and among ourselves in security assistance and capacity building to their advantage. And actually, Japan, the United States, and Australia, these three navies have been cooperating on capacity building support to Vietnam to help build Vietnam Navy's submarine capabilities by helping their underwater medicine capability. So that's an example, I think. Well, talking about North Korea, thank you very much for asking that question. Actually, can we think that North Korea is truly committed to denuclearization in our own terms? I don't think so. North Korea requires nuclear weapons as deterrent of the nation and of his own, Kim Jong-un's regime. And so I personally do not think that North Korea will abandon nuclear weaponry. And North Korea said once that the United States attacks countries without nuclear weapons. So the Trump administration is the same. That's what Kim Jong-un said. That's what North Korea said 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that the North Koreans still think so. So, and also the major part of the North Korean armed forces is just nuclear weapons and missiles. Of course, they have a large number of special forces, but special forces cannot defend North Korea. So they need nuclear weapons as important, indispensable deterrent. And they say that if North Korea can get security guarantee from the United States and some other countries, then they are willing to abandon nuclear weapons. But can we believe that? If they pursue both of them, security guarantee and nuclear weapons, then it's a very different story. So we have to be very, very skeptical. And actually, they are continuing their nuclear development and missile development. So we need to keep pressuring North Korea. I think that currently the balance between pressure and engagement is lost, I think. Particularly because of the Trump administration or Trump himself. But we have to see what's going on in the North Korean military itself and what's going on in North Korea itself. And there are a number of people who visited North Korea recently, and many of them say that at least in Pyongyang, there are so many commodities, including whiskey of Santry. So, someone or some countries are violating the UN sanctions. So we have to cooperate. We have to keep cooperating to monitor the ship-to-ship transfers and in many other fields to check North Korea.
I think the possible repercussions of the killing of General Soleimani are interesting too in terms of calculations, but I want to go back to a very Canadian question with you, David, and that is Canadian energy. Because Trans Mountain, the whole point of it is to send Canadian energy to Asia. Now with what's going on in terms of the protests over what's happening on the Wet'suwet'en land with the RCMP presence, questions about whether natural resource projects can proceed, what do you see as the opportunity and the jeopardy for Canadian energy in terms of becoming a supplier, as Robert pointed out, for the Indo-Pacific that could offer that stable energy supply, but we seem to have a lot of trouble getting it to the coastline?
I think right now that it's more a case of jeopardy, and what's been playing out over the last weeks has not been a great advertisement for not just Canadian energy, but for Canadian governance, Canadian capability. The first country that needs to take this seriously is not the many markets in Asia Pacific, it's Canada. If we aspire to continue to exist as an independent country and to play a role in the world, we have to develop our economy. And we can't develop our economy unless we don't look seriously at the energy sector, we don't invest in infrastructure, and we don't find alternative buyers for our energy products. Otherwise, we have a single planet. But that should be seen as a national priority and a national resource, and I don't think it is. And I think we've talked about the assets you need to have a foreign policy. It starts, I think, with awareness that we are a country that is obliged to be international. We have the great fortune of having the United States as our neighbor, but we also have many opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. I'm excited about opportunities in Europe. I think there's a lot of energy and opportunity there for us, and I think we've got a pretty good trade deal. But I think what I worry about is a current deficit in that national sense of the importance of engaging the world. More than that, there is a deficit, I think, in terms of our national will. To have a foreign policy, you have to believe in the nation, you have to believe in our role in the world, you have to believe in our mission in the world. We used to believe in that. We've spent a decade and more navel gazing, looking at some of the problems in our society, but making that our main message in the world, and that is counterproductive. So until we regain this awareness of our international role, until we reestablish a sense of national will and purpose and a belief in this country that is positive, that it's basically a force for good in the world, we won't make the progress we need to make. And that would be a tragedy, not only because we have these resources that the world needs, but their development is crucial to our own prosperity and success as a country.
Do you think that's something that we can do in time? Because one of the discussions has been that by the time these resource projects get developed, it's been so long in the delays that we may have missed the window. Is the window still there if the political will becomes there and if the conditions are set?
I think the window is still there. You know, we're a big resource-rich country with a lot of capability, and we still have a reserve of goodwill in the world. But with energy projects, as with military procurement, as with other national priorities, unless we get going, that window will close on us. So there's time, but there's not unlimited time.
We just have a few moments left, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give me your closing comments, and if you can put this a little bit in the perspective of what you think the blueprint for the Indo-Pacific looks like going forward, and what role can Canada play? Starting with you, Robert.
Well, I mean, I think what we've heard tonight is the fact that freedom isn't free. And when we started looking at the national security strategy, we focused on first principles, on values. What are we trying to promote both in our own society and the world abroad? Because America can't be an island unto itself. It must encourage and really embrace a community of nations that seek to have free trade, democratic principles, rule of law, and self-determination as a key foundation of their societies. And so we have to fight. We have to stand up and fight for the values and the principles that we want. We have to do it together. And it doesn't help if we invite those in that actually seek to suppress those or destroy those values. And so it's really about establishing an appreciation for democracy and free trade in a way that delivers value, really prosperity and freedom to our citizens in a way that can encourage the future growth and prosperity of our nations and other nations abroad that would embrace democracy going forward.
David?
I think there's a lot of thinking and planning and analysis that has to go into it. It's also a practical matter, and we learn through doing. And the very idea of engaging in a new way with the Indo-Pacific region is a way of approaching our foreign policy in a new way. So I think it offers us a lot of promise. There's a clear welcome from the region. I think our return in some places is overdue. So I think it's one of the smartest and best things we could do in terms, not just of foreign policy, but any one of our major national priorities.
Hideshi?
Yes, I have 2 points. The basic foundation of the Indo-Pacific regional security is the U.S.-centered alliance relationship. And from a Japanese point of view, the Japan-U.S. alliance relationship is the core of the that alliance network. However, it is not fully developed network yet. Of course, it is developing, but there are some shortfalls. And also, the U.S. is the only country which can counter China. However, there is a limit in what the U.S. can do alone. So therefore, at this juncture, it is important to master our efforts to strengthen the U.S.-centered alliance relationship in the Indo-Pacific. That's one thing. And secondly, we have to we have to establish a larger network to network such smaller networks, including India. Actually, India is not an ally of the U.S. or Japan, but it is a very autonomous country. But we have many common things with India. So therefore, we have to cooperate with India and also with some other countries as well. So we have to think about networking already existing smaller networks, alliance network and ASEAN-centered network, and so rather than think about building a completely new architecture. But anyway, that region, I mean the Indo-Pacific region, is very much unstable because the economic system is very large, including China, but the security structure is very small because it is excluding China. So anyway, the large economic structure is based on that smaller security architecture. That's a problem. So we have to stabilize this situation. In order to stabilize this situation, we have to think about networking the existing networks. And Canada can be in it and should be in it.
All right. Last word to you, Dhruva.
Well, I already discussed in some ways the evolution of the free and open Indo-Pacific, what some of the drivers of that have been, primarily related to China's rise and behavior, some of what India is doing, whether it's on the Belt and Road Initiative or in terms of maritime security. But I thought I would end on what I, as an outsider, see the potential role of Canada. And I'm actually quite optimistic about the potential role that Canada can play in this broader region. For a few reasons. I think we have to reinforce the fact that Canada is a Pacific country, and one only has to go to Vancouver, British Columbia to feel it. You see the large number of Chinese and Korean and Japanese cultural influences there. To see in Victoria the maritime presence that Canada brings to the Pacific. That Canada is a major international investor. That the stock of Canadian FDI was only recently surpassed by the stock of Chinese FDI, overseas FDI. That Canada is a major energy superpower, it's a major education superpower, it's a major agricultural superpower. And I think that these are tools that Canada brings to the table. And lastly, I would emphasize the soft power potential that Canada has. And I don't just mean the Toronto Raptors or Alice Munro or Drake. I mean the fact that you can have a parliamentary democracy where the leaders debate each other not just one, but two languages. And I think that that's a model that Canada brings. I can't think of another country where that's the case. So I think Canada does bring a lot of value to reinforcing a free and open Indo-Pacific order, and I do think it should approach this region with a great deal of confidence.
Well, thank you very much to our panel for a phenomenal discussion, all your insights. We truly appreciate it.
First and foremost, a big thanks to Mercedes Stephenson for navigating the gambit of Indo-Pacific issues. I'd like to invite the rest of our guests, Robert, David, Hideshi, and Dhruva, to leave the stage now in an orderly fashion as I wrap up the program. But as they do that, please, a round of applause for incredible insight across the issues of security, prosperity, values. I don't think, Dr. Crowley and I were trying to pay attention, but I don't think that Ottawa has experienced such a high-quality conversation about the Indo-Pacific in quite some time. I'd like to say this is perhaps the bar, and we will continue to try and raise it. A joke. What do Norway, Thailand, and Australia have in common? A negligent MC. Norway and Thailand were here this evening. We're so happy to host them. I'm sorry I missed acknowledging them at the outset of this evening. This event could not have been possible were it not for some extraordinary colleagues who I take credit for their work all the time. That would include David Watson, David McDonough, Brett Byers-Lane, Amber Russell, Allison Kerrigan, George Hapchi, Tristan Mealy, Jennifer Beam Singh, and of course Jonathan Berkshire Miller. Could you all take a stand, please, and be acknowledged? We have a great team, full of exceptional people, constantly raising the bar and elevating the national debate. One of the great things about being employed and engaged at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is the ambition that its founder, our managing director, Dr. Brian Lee Crowley, brings to the table. Not only is he a friend, a mentor, a teacher, he is somebody who constantly pushes myself and our colleagues to think boldly about what Canada is in the world, about what the world is, for the facts on the ground and to advance the big ideas, to be unabashed, to be clear-minded, to do so articulately in a way that is accessible to the highest experts in public policy and foreign policy as are assembled in this room today, as well as to the Canadian public. Thought leadership is a very difficult vocation, and it is made possible because we stand on the shoulders 10 years later after Dr. Brian Lee Crowley's vision. Thank you, sir, for creating such an incredible platform. And with that, I'm so honored to have been your MC tonight. Thank you for your time. We're now 10 minutes overdue, so I hope you've received the parking tickets, passes, I should say, not the tickets. I hope that if you've had a couple of drinks that you'll encourage yourself to take an Uber and get home safely. Stay warm, and we'll see you next year. Thank you very much for a wonderful evening.